Hey, welcome back, everybody. Of course, you know me. My name is Dr. Keith McNally. This is Coach's Corner, and this is going to be the easiest name I've had so far ever. This is Ann Betz. Ann, welcome to the show. And you are a coach in many different ways. And so, in our first conversation, our last conversation, you told me about a very specific population. So, relationship, people who have received experienced trauma in
Yeah,
relationships.
yeah,
Can we
I call it relational trauma.
relational trauma? I think that's becoming more and more a thing. And so I want to learn more about it and how you approach that. And really, how did you get started in that? Because that's really unique.
Yeah, it's so there's starting to be more of a conversation in coaching. So I've been a coach for 22 years this fall. Um, and there's starting just in the last year or two more of a conversation about trauma and coaching. And so when I looked at trauma and coaching, I thought, well, there's different types of trauma, and they all have an impact, and they all could certain people can benefit from coaching depending on the person. We can talk about that. But what is the most prevalent one, and one is the most one that chugs to my heart? It's the trauma that occurs in relationships. And it's a little different than the trauma that might come from like being in a natural disaster. That's going
Okay.
to be traumatic, like you're in an earthquake or something. That's going
Hurricane,
to be
where I am.
hurricane,
Yeah.
exactly. Very traumatic, but it's not personal. And relational trauma is often much more complex because it's personal and we have mixed feelings about the person, and it is a more complicated and also unfortunately more common.
So you said you've been doing coaching for 2 decades now.
Yeah.
How did that become a thing for you? Like, what did you transition out of? And how did you
Oh
get
my
into
gosh.
this particular relationship trauma focus?
Well, it came out of I was a consultant, and so I mean, there's probably multiple answers, but one answer is that I was doing work and I was doing like organizational interventions, and they weren't really having the impact that I wish they would have, because what I really saw was often there were personalities, there were people that needed to have more awareness, that the system needed to be addressed, but there also needed to be something on the personal level that was holding things up. And at the time, I wasn't really aware of coaching. So remember, this was like 2001. It was not a thing in quite the way it is now,
Right.
right? Um, so I started getting frustrated with my work as a consultant, felt like I could have a better impact. And I also love to have deeply meaningful conversations. I was a philosophy major. I love meaning. I love what motivates us. That gets me out of bed in the morning. And so a friend asked me, what would you do if nobody paid you? And I said, I would have deeply meaningful conversations.
That person sounds like the first coach. What
Right.
would you do if?
And I'm like, and my second response to that is, yeah, good luck to me. Right. Yeah. Good luck with that. And she said, no, there's a profession for that. I had no idea.
Wow. See, she was the first coach.
Yeah, well, she wasn't actually. She did not become a coach. She was a consultant, but she knew about it, and she kind of sent me in that direction. And I studied coaching. And the from the first class that I went to, I thought, I'm at home. This is where I want to be. This is how I like to be with people. This is how this feels right. It feels right that I'm helping them find the answers rather than coming in as an expert. All of that feels really right to me, and so it's been a profession of love for 20 years.
But you told me it comes from the conversation. You like having conversations with people. You just told me that. What that has to be a very specific type, coaching has to be a very specific type of conversation. What does that conversation look like?
Yeah, well, I would say it's a conversation of depth.
Okay.
It's a one of the words that I like is that it's a disruptive conversation.
Mm.
So it's a transformational conversation. So I am part of my background is that I'm a neuroscience expert, and I'm actually probably one of the main experts in the world on specifically the neuroscience of coaching. It's like being a medium-sized fish in a very, very small pond. Um,
Oh,
so it's like make of that what you will, because I'm fascinated by those two things and how they intersect. And when I'm talking to people about the kind of questions that we ask in coaching, I could ask you an open-ended question, like, where do you live? Well, that's an open-ended question. It's not a yes, no question. But it's different than a question that makes you think or that might make you rethink. So if I ask you, for example, how do you feel about where you live? That's going to activate something else in the brain that's going to activate neurons firing, looking for that answer. You might question yourself. You might say, wow, I have an
Never been asked
automatic
that
answer.
before. Yeah.
Oh yeah, nobody ever asked me that before. That's a good question. How do I feel about it? And then the aspect of, if I am there with you and I am really listening and I'm saying, and you're getting the sense I really want to hear, um, you may answer differently than if you just, meet somebody in a bar. Oh, how do you feel about where you live? Who doesn't seem as interested. So all of it does something to the person's brain that I find to be very, like, all the research points to that it is a technology. Coaching is a technology that's really transformational. And I think that's why I like those conversations.
I kind of like those conversations too. However, I've never used the word, and I'm going to get this, destructive,
Disruptive.
disruptive.
Not
My
I mean, it might
forgiveness.
be destructive of old patterns, but I
It,
think of it as more
it was my
we
error. So disruptive.
disruptive.
How does, how can you walk into a conversation knowing that you're going to disrupt? And I'm not even trying to use this in a negative way.
No, I
Now I'm
know.
really curious. How do you know?
Um,
Because you're going in there in a safe space. They're coming to you from maybe not a safe space.
yeah,
How do
that's
you
part
get
of
that? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's part of my job as a coach. And this part of my job is to be present in a way that creates safety. We
Mhm.
self-regulate with each other. And if I can be with the person in a certain way, and that is by active listening, being reflective, being warm, giving them space, deeply listening to what they're saying, listening to what they're not saying as well. If I can be with them in that way, what will generally happen, depending on the other person and their trauma, which might get to the trauma or not, is that they will come into a place of trust and openness with me. Some might come into it in the very first session, in the sample session. They might just feel like they can extend that trust. Others, it might take 3-4 sessions before they really get to that point. I've had people that I've worked with where the first level of trust was there, and then after a couple of years, they've said, I need to tell you something I've never told anyone before.
Mm.
And that was actually about trauma. So that trust, like that was an example of what she had to tell me was so tender that she actually needed a couple of years
Mm.
before she was ready. And then she'd never told anyone before.
And that's really okay.
Yeah.
You told me earlier that your passion is to work directly with people, I guess on a very much one-on-one scenario, yes?
Well, I work on 2 levels. I actually am I have a small practice. It's
Okay.
probably not my main passion. I'm a teacher, and so I teach trauma informed coaching. I
Okay.
teach the neuroscience of coaching, and then I keep a small practice. And at this point in my practice, as of the last 2-3 years, it is dominantly people who are either processing what happened to them in relational trauma, or they're trying to leave a relationship that isn't serving them, whether that's a romantic partner, could be a workplace trauma,
Mm.
or it could be in the family. It could be anything from a sibling to a parent. Whatever that is, they might need to figure out how they move on from that, or they may have already moved on and need to figure out what it means to them and what the imprint is that it has left them with, that may not be serving them, like in other relationships like that.
Well, now you kind of open up, Pandora's box. There's so many ways to approach how I want to go forward with this conversation. But if I could, the trauma that somebody experiences and has to deal with, even though it comes from, a different type of scenario, and you mentioned work, family, or even partnership trauma. Are the symptoms of that trauma the same, or is
Yeah.
it very unique to the
No,
situation?
they tend to be fairly the same because the makeup of the people who create relational trauma tends to be fairly the same.
Okay.
And so we get into questions, and this is a hot word right now. So we get into questions of narcissistic traits. And let me be clear, when I talk about narcissism, I don't mean it as a diagnosis, it's a description. It's like saying somebody's anxious. It's like saying somebody is highly has a nervous personality or an outgoing personality. Narcissistic is a personality description, but it's a personality description that the higher the stronger the traits, or the higher the number of traits, the more predictable it is they will create a certain amount of disruption in the people that they are working with, parenting, in intimate partnership with, siblings, etc., because they're driven by a fairly consistent need, which is the never-ending need for stimulation and attention.
Mm.
Um, and kind of to the point where, and again, it's a continuum. So it's the higher the number of the traits, kind of the worse it is. And I don't diagnose people, but I do describe them. So, so yeah, it's, I have seen, people have similar responses to a very, very narcissistic boss
Mm.
as they have to a very narcissistic partner or parent or sibling.
So your focus, and I want to use the word correctly, um, you're not focused on the person that you are describing as narcissistic. Your focus is on the other person, the person who
No.
has to make sense of or leave or heal from that traumatic relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not there. The research, unfortunately, and this is sad, but the research is that folks that are, the higher, again, the number of traits and behaviors, that the less likely it is that they will experience any change. And it's tough. And when we as coaches, I was trained to believe in the possibility of people, and, everybody's capable of change and growth. That goes back to Carl Rogers. People are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And, that's a belief about people. And I think it's a really good belief about people to stand in as coaches.
Mhm.
Is it absolutely true about every human being? Is every human being capable of growth and change? There do seem to be some personality types that are not.
Okay.
And that's a little radical to say, by the way.
We'll put that on the table.
it's
And if it,
it's what I was just teaching this, and I said, Carl Rogers, this was his belief about people, and that's where we get it originally. I believe it might go back earlier. That's the first place I found it. He believed people were that. That's a lovely belief. I love that. I believe that about most people, but it was not a scientifically validated truth. And those are different things.
okay. And that's good to know. When you work with people who have experienced this trauma, and I'm hearing that word more and more,
Yeah.
unfortunately, and I think you mentioned that earlier in our conversation. Um, it are people who are in those relationships, like stay in that relationship regardless of situation. So family, work, personal, are, and I want to use the word diagnose, do they have a diagnosis that says
They
like dependency, or and
Yeah.
am I going
Oh,
down the
that's a good
wrong?
question. No, no, no. It's a really good question. It's probably the number one question people ask. Like,
Okay.
okay, so I'm, have had, I was watching a video, and this woman was saying, yeah, I've had like 6 narcissistic boyfriends. Like, what is it? What
Wow.
is it? What about that? Like, what is going on with me? So there's 2 answers to that
Okay.
question. And again, this is, I have a scientific frame of mind because I'm I'm a neuroscience expert. And so I don't want to just go with what people believe. I want to, like, what's the research say? So here is what the research says. the dominant percentage of people who get involved with, get targeted, which is the word I like. I don't like victim. I don't even like survivor. Personally, I like target of a narcissist don't tend to be weak, diminished people who are looking for anyone to pay attention to them. That's kind of the, the sitcom version of
Cliche,
it,
yeah.
the
Yeah.
cliche.
Yeah.
What the research says is that there might be some percentage of that, but it's a very small percentage, like maybe like one research study I'm thinking of, it's 20%.
Okay.
80%, it's actually the exact opposite. It's something that this particular researcher, named is Sandra Brown, calls super traits. And
Hmm.
that really what we're looking at is people who may be very, stay in a narcissistic relationship. It is because they are incredibly empathetic, incredibly loyal, very responsible. You don't get narcissists asking themselves if they're, am I the narcissist? And, like that. But to almost every single one of my clients who has dealt with that at some point in our coaching has said to me, maybe I'm the narcissist. And I'm like, okay, I've got a little checklist so they can see if they are.
Okay.
Because they're so empathetic and they're so willing to say, and they'll say, look, I'm not perfect either. Or, yeah, they push me and push me, but then I flew off the handle, so I'm not off the hook, and they're
They're making
always
excuses.
they're they're making excuses, but they're also looking for, what's my responsibility? I don't want to point the finger. They also tend to be values driven and very loyal. And so they don't want to give up. They don't want to give up on the first time somebody maybe treats them badly. People with super traits will say, well, I understand they're really stressed right now, and I can see this. And yeah, maybe I shouldn't have brought this topic up at a sensitive time, and I don't want to give up. I promised. Oh my God, my clients, I promised, but I promised. I made a vow. I'm like, yeah, but you didn't make a vow to be abused. But that is what drives it, much more so than like a sort of diminished, fractured, weak personality. It's actually the traits that attract narcissists and keep people in narcissistic relationships are the very traits that make them wonderful in healthy relationships. Because
Mm.
don't you want that? If you're with your partner, don't you want them to go, you know what? Hold on a minute. What's my responsibility here?
So
Right?
yeah, some loyalty, some communication,
Totally.
responsibility, accountability. It's perfect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You want
Yeah.
that, but it's a two-way street, whereas with a narcissist, it's a one-way street.
So my natural next question, and this may
Yeah.
be a coaching question. I have to uh, hire you, and I don't want to do that just yet. Um, how do you help somebody? And this probably be one of the closing questions for our talk today. How do you help them get that? I want to say, see the light. When
Yeah.
does that light bulb come on and say, "Now I understand"?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of layers, and I'll try not to make it this answer too long. The first thing that I think is really, and it's interesting because this kind of coaching is a little different than, if I'm doing like leadership coaching or something. So there's an aspect of education.
Okay.
Yeah, people need to know, like, here's the pattern. It's pretty consistent. And, let's take a look at the pattern here. This is not unique to you. So let's educate you about this dynamic and what's going on. The other thing that I have found they need is they need to, when we are being treated in an abusive way, which could be being yelled at, it could be that the person's very emotionally calm, but is gaslighting you, lying to you, or hiding things. I never said that. Oh, I never promised I'd pay you back, or I never promised you'd get that promotion, like that. It's really, really disruptive to your nervous system and your cognitive systems and your memory system. It disrupts memory in a number of ways.
Hmm.
So the other thing that I often do very, very early on with clients, education, they need to know the patterns, and they need to pull in the pieces of their own story, because that's very fragmented. And so we will spend more time in this kind of coaching, if you're working with me at least, we will spend more time telling the story, but not because of, not because I don't want the person to move forward and be empowered, but because what we need to do first is reconstruct the fragments, because the story has gotten fragmented for most targets of abuse in a way that they can't quite make sense of it. And I would say those two things are really, really like they are the beginning of the process. Um, Also part of reconstructing the story, we often do something, I call it a red flags list. It's sort of known in this kind of work, where I'll have the person reflect on what happened, what the other person did, what they did, and how they felt.
Mm,
Because I want them to start seeing the patterns, and it's very protective against going back. And that's a real risk because of the cognitive dissonance that being treated in an abusive way, it's intermittent reinforcement. So it's generally, they're not horrible all the time. So they're horrible, horrible, horrible. And then you get a breadcrumb of a little bit nice. And we're so hungry for that.
yeah.
It feels so good. The apology that we've been waiting for finally. And so people in abusive relationships are at high risk to get, they call it being hoovered, being sucked from the vacuum cleaner, being sucked back in. So I like to have them really unpack the relationship so that they can kind of go, yeah, okay, yep, happened before. Yep. We had 3 good weeks and then they started yelling at me again. So
Well,
those would be the two things.
I do like the fact that when you said educate the target, was that one of the first things is to tell them that there's a pattern here and you're not unique.
Yeah,
This
sorry.
isn't, you're not, yeah, you're
It's like
not unique here.
you're wonderful, but you're not so special. And people will say to me, I have to self-manage a lot because people will say, well, you're not going to believe what he did. And I will tell you 99 times out of 100, I can predict it.
Yeah, because you know the pattern.
I know the
Absolutely.
pattern, and it's driven by brain chemistry from what I can tell. And so, when you understand that it's driven by something that's going on in the brain that's different than the rest of us, you can start seeing, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. It's very, very common for people who are high in narcissism to also have some other, in psychology, they call it comorbidity, but
Mm.
they'll be gamblers, or they'll have an alcohol or a drug addiction, or they'll be serial cheaters. And that's really typical because what they're looking for is they're looking for dopamine. They're looking for that zhuzh, that kind of excitement in their life. And it doesn't matter who they partner with or hire or whatever, at some point, familiarity wears off, wears the dopamine off. They're not getting it anymore. So of course they're looking for something else. It's very, very predictable.
So how do people find you? And are you taking clients now?
I have a
Um,
limited space. I do
okay.
usually have room for one or two. I'm definitely interested in people who want to make meaning out of it, but also be heard and seen, and not just, we don't do the spiritual bypass. Oh, that really was terrible, but it's all good. It's not all good,
Right.
and it's not fair. And so, yeah, but that's probably the best client for me, is somebody who's saying, I want to like put the pieces of myself back together so that I'm even stronger. And they can find me. I'm Ann at BEaboveleadership.com. That's my main website, is BEabove, BE, like be above, leadership.com. And that's where we run our programs. And if coaches are interested in getting trained in that, that's also where our training programs, you can find out about our training programs.
Sounds wonderful. And thank you so much for this conversation. Just one more thing, and in 30 seconds or less, inspire somebody today, please, who's listening. Don't tell them to come to your coaching because we're going to do that anyway.
No.
Inspire somebody to
Mm.
give them a ray of hope, or at least to think about change.
Yeah, here's the thing. Um, I come into this because it happened to me. And it was the darkest time of my life. And it happened to me as an adult.
Mm.
And so, one of the things that you need to know is it gets better. You can get out of it. You can move on, as it is something where the common response is there's no way out. And I want to tell you that there is. There is a way out, and life gets better, and you deserve so much more. And it can happen to even just really smart, self-aware people, because the people that do this kind of abuse are con men, and they're or women, and they're good at it. And so if you got caught up in it, no shame, and it gets better.
And thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been another edition of Coach's Corner, and we'll see you next time. Take care.